Welcome back. This next lesson focuses on African American women and their feminist movement. So I address how white feminists kind of look at the world, and they looked at it as a kind of structural problem between men and women, right? Not that men were the complete enemies, but definitely part of the problem. Black feminists look at the world a little bit differently. There's a great book called Different Roads to Feminism that addresses these different perspectives too, in case you're interested in reading. Kind of like the big issue with African American women was this report called the Moynihan Report that was written in 1965 to understand kind of black poverty. And in this report, it basically argued that part of the reason why African Americans were in poverty was because they lacked a structured nuclear family that was, kind of heterosexual, and husband, wife, and then kids, like say the Anglo-American family. And a lot of people had problems with this report. Conservatives loved it because it reinforced a lot of stereotypes that they had about African Americans, but African Americans were not happy with it because then African American men felt like they had to be the dominant one in these relationships. So it became a very problematic report. So we see within the report that many men try to challenge that idea that the black family is led by a black mother, if you will, and try to enforce certain ideas that were mostly associated with Anglo-American families, such as the nuclear family, and also this notion of the black women should not have control of their bodies. Well, black feminists were not happy about any of this, so they created an organization to address some of these issues. Not so much about this report itself, but what the black family experienced, that they could talk better about why African Americans were in poverty. And things that they addressed really made a connection, not so much with, oh, it's the family that's the problem. They said, no, that's not really the issue. The issue is more white kind of dominance, white racism. So, particularly Western racism. So they kind of tied it to colonialism, that American and Western society has always used people of color and have colonized them in different ways, either colonized the nations. In Africa, it was all colonized by European powers, or in the United States. So they tied their struggle with struggles that other African American women experienced throughout the world. Some of these black feminists were also anti-capitalist. Many of them argued that capitalism is the problem. Capitalism is what creates this inequality, because just by the nature of capitalism itself, somebody needs to be above somebody else, dominating. So some of them were what they called neo-communists, where they adhere to certain values of communism, but they address it from a gender lens, right, from a woman's lens. And you saw some of that with the article that you read by Solanas. They also said that white women could not understand them. So a lot of times white feminists saying, well, join our movement. We already have a women's movement, more numbers, more power. And some of the black feminists said, no, you don't quite understand our struggle. Yes, we have gender as a commonality, but it's not the same experience, right? And we don't see men as a problem, particularly our black men. They could be a group that can help us, whereas white feminists saw men as the issue. Though you do have some black women joining the white feminist movement, such as organizations such as NOW. And then something else that they saw as different was that black feminists and black women in general have always worked, unlike, again, that 1950s white woman who was at the house taking care of the kids, living this kind of middle class life. So again, it's an experience that it's not really shared by both groups, where black women have always had to work, and they worked in kind of I mentioned in the last lecture, they did a lot of domestic work. The Anglo-American middle class feminists did not have to go through some of these experiences. So black feminists kind of argued that women of color face what's called a triple oppression. Because of the color of their skin, they face racism. Because of their economic class, they're poor, they feel a form of oppression. And because they're women, right? So these three things, race, class, and gender, impede women from being viewed as equal. Again, something that white feminists could not understand. So some of their goals, number one, was that they wanted to have the black body represented in a positive way. A lot of times, African American women were presented as Jezebels or as sexual objects, and a lot of this was done through films or television shows, and it became almost somewhat of a script that this is the way African Americans are portrayed, as mammies or as over sexualized characters. And they wanted to these black feminists wanted black women to be represented as definitely more complex images, but also kind of challenged some of these stereotypes that have been created by Hollywood. They wanted that an education for not only black feminists but also their children. They wanted programs to help women of color who were single mothers, and that education that their kids receive kind of focus on black culture as something positive, whereas typically in American culture during this period, African American culture was viewed as something negative and as something that impedes them from being successful. These black feminists said, no, there's value in our culture, and obviously they loved it too, so they wanted their culture to be represented to their children in a very positive light. Other issues that they dealt with was health issues, particularly abortion. They wanted, like white feminists, they saw that as a commonality, that abortion was something that they wanted access to also. But then something that white feminists didn't understand is this next issue of forced sterilization. I'll address this with Mexican American women. I'll show you a clip of what they went through. But in the 1960s and 70s, African American women, some were being sterilized without their consent, and or at least women of color too. Native American women went through this, Mexican American, but also African American women. And this is something that white feminists didn't encounter. Quite often, women of color were kind of pushed towards sterilization because the belief was that women of color, black women, and so forth, use up all the welfare and they only have kids so they can get more welfare, which is a myth. They wanted to address self-reliance. They wanted, because not every family is a nuclear family, so they wanted to have that opportunity to make a living. But they also address welfare rights. I think there's a book called Storming Caesar's Palace that addresses these type of issues in Vegas. I think I remember that correctly. I could be wrong though. It's been a while since I read some of these books. They address issues of rape and sexual abuse. A lot of times when women of color get sexually abused, it goes unnoticed or unrecognized. Police probably sometimes didn't follow through with some of these cases because women of color just didn't matter. So they wanted to address those type of issues. And then lastly, address issues of black lesbianism, particularly when it came to parental rights, because again, the belief is that the American family is a nuclear family, and these women were saying, no, people love different people, and people love who they love. And they wanted to make sure that, when they did fall into a relationship that were women and women, that, both parents had rights there too, which again, very unique for the 1960s and 70s. During this era, the gay movement doesn't start until the late 60s with Stonewall. So these women are addressing those issues throughout, the late 60s and into the 70s. All right, so we'll stop it there. And the next subject that I'll address is Chicana feminism.